What's going on, bottom line viewers? This is Kevole. Hope you're having a great weekend. Talking a little bit about one of the more controversial topics in wrestling today is the Vince Russo versus Jim Cornette feud. Jim Cornette was recently on a table for three a couple weeks ago with Eric Bischoff and Michael Hayes, and that was after the Raw episode. And they talked a lot about how they felt about Vince Russo. Well, in an edited version, but in the unedited version of Table for Three, they went on a pretty lengthy hate-on for Vince Russo. And Russo actually ended up responding by challenging Cornette to a debate on one of their podcasts. Vince Russo has a podcast. Jim Cornette had a podcast. Has a podcast, and Cornette responded basically by challenging Russo to a fight. He said he would bring $5,000 that Russo can try to get out of his hand, and give him a address, and they will go and meet. No cameras, no guns. I don't know how that even makes any sense to me. No guns. Like, maybe Cornette just walks around with a gun. Anyway, I'm not judging. No this, no that, no anything else. And they just have a fight. And whoever wins, I guess, is supposed to get the $5,000. Russo's response was, well, let's have a debate and put some money up to help out a charitable organization. And we'll debate the merits of the success between Russo and Cornette. Cornette's response is, we'll get into Cornette's response as we go on here. Now, I think what, I'm going to get to what riled me up the most about this, but I think we need to talk about these two individuals and their contributions to professional wrestling, and the impact that they had. Now, I think that Vince Russo is probably one of the more controversial figures in professional wrestling. If you remember, he was part of the writing team that wrote for the Attitude Era, which is the most successful era in WWE history. And he had Austin and The Rock and Triple H and a number of stars and a number of different storylines. Some worked, some did not. Choppy PP did not work. There's other things that did not work. But the product, he was one of the figures in the Monday Night Wars that helped turn the tide from WCW back to Monday Night Raw with his contributions. Now, you can say going forward that this was also in part to Vince McMahon, and that's certainly fair. Vince McMahon is the overall overseer of all things WWE. We all know that, watching the wrestling product. But it's hard to say that Vince Russo wasn't successful under the WWF WWE product back during that Attitude Era. I mean, and it's not, I mean, he was from 92 to 99, had the creative tree in 1996. It was at an all-time ratings low, Monday Night Raw, and then it went to a high. And you look at some of the feuds: Stone Cold versus Mr. McMahon, Undertaker Kane, D-Generation X, the Rock and Sock Connection, one of the best segments in Monday Night Raw history that was trying to be recaptured horribly, by the way, with Alexa Bliss and Bayley. And yes, it's then he left and he joined the WCW in 1999, and for a number of different reasons it didn't work. But he tried his same style and he didn't work. And part of it was part of it his problem? I would say yes. I think that a lot of the people that worked with him found him difficult to work with. I don't know if Vince Russo has ever denied that he has ever been difficult to work with. Certainly not. He did absolutely cross some personal boundaries with the J.R. Ed Fair characters, portraying J.R. He did some other interesting things. I mean, one of the most controversial things was the David Arquette winning the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, booking himself as a world champion. But by the way, Vince McMahon did that once. Vince McMahon also won a Royal Rumble, by the way. So, certainly, and then of course you have the infamous Bash at the Beach controversy, which I think everyone involved has a bit of something to contribute to that. Bischoff, Hogan, Russo, Jarrett, Booker T, I think all have something probably to contribute to that. And we'll never fully know the full story for that. Everyone has a different perspective for that. And then, of course, he went on to TNA. And as Cornette did mention, was secretly part of TNA at one point where his reputation wasn't as solid. But he also wrote some pretty successful angles for TNA. Kurt Angle, Samoa Joe. Some would argue that his building to that, from a writing's perspective, how he built that was probably too fast. It didn't necessarily work, and he rushed it. That's fine. It still was something that was successful for him. He also created some of the higher ratings for WCW during that 2000 period when he didn't have Austin, The Rock, Triple H. He didn't have a lot of those stars that could create the excitement that they did on Raw that he could on WCW. So he had to do some different things to create a buzz and a controversy. That was his job. And his style is a bit more crash TV, air quote. It's to catch you off guard. It's to keep your attention. Does that work for everybody? No. It doesn't necessarily work for me because there's sometimes for me, there is too much going on. And it's hard to kind of follow. I think that Vince Russo, for me, and I even look back when him and Eric Bischoff got involved with the whole old blood versus new blood feud when they revamped WCW and they were both in charge. I think the concept of that feud and the feuds that surrounded that were pretty good. It was a good idea. It was a good feud because that was what was relevant and going on in WCW. That was what the big controversy was. The older generation was holding down the younger generation. That was the ones that were keeping WCW from going forward. That was the whole debate of whether WCW was successful or not. And that idea, bringing that feud to life and adding some real life to it, and even pushing the boundaries of some of the insults that he did, that's a good idea. The execution didn't necessarily work. But I think the intent of what Vince Russo does is an interesting idea. And you look at current wrestling product right now, there really isn't anything that is keeping our attention like that back then. It's much different. It's much tamer. It's not as exciting. I mean, you've heard Mitch and Dylan talk about Monday Night Nap, as they've called Raw at times. But Russo tried to, whether you like his style or not, and I'm not a big fan, necessarily the biggest fan as other people, but I think that he is a guy that tried to do things a different way, and in some ways it actually was successful. In the long term, maybe it wasn't as successful as it could have been. That's probably would be my critique of Vince Russo. I've never worked with Vince Russo. I've heard stories about Vince Russo that he was very difficult to work with. He addresses some of that from his perspective. Jim Cornette. Let's talk about Jim Cornette. When you think of Jim Cornette, what do you think of? Yeah, that silence probably is something. That tells you what Jim Cornette really has done. His most notable thing was in the 80s when he was involved in the feud with the Midnight Express. Yeah, he was involved with the Championship Radio Yokozuna and the Lex Express. That was kind of him. He was in part of TNA. He had a feud with Kevin Steen, slash now known as Kevin Owens in Ring of Honor. He was involved in OVW with John Cena, Randy Orton, Dave Bautista's Brock Lesnar, but he wasn't the guy that brought them in. That was Jim Ross. That was not Jim Cornette. So Cornette's one of those guys that people seem to think is one of the most brilliant minds in professional wrestling. But when I look at this resume of Jim Cornette, I struggle at times, to be honest with you, to see it. I don't see this guy as one of the more pure wrestling geniuses out there. I don't see this guy with a list of successes. He wants to talk about Vince Russo as this disaster for wrestling, but yet Jim Cornette was fired for publicly bashing people. Jim Cornette has never worked well with others either. So for Jim Cornette to go off on the way that on Vince Russo the way that he did is a complete hypocrisy. And not only that, and as much as the wrestling marks, again in air quotes, as much as these wrestling marks out there are praising Cornette for his epic promo, let's really talk about the difference between the two promos. Russo, in his public apology, which you can see on air quotes, I'm using air quotes again, with his public apology on YouTube, he remained calm. Was it a bit of an insult? Yeah, it was. Bit of a personal insult. But he also kind of reminded us calmly Cornette's career accomplishments or lack of career accomplishments. The demise of Smoky Mountain. The fact that he's been fired several times. The fact that as much as Cornette can claim that Vince Russo was a disaster to this business and a disaster to everywhere that he worked and a train wreck, Cornette was actually no better. And a lot of wrestling marks don't want to admit that. But look at Cornette's resume, the fact remains that in an even longer stint, Cornette has contributed in many ways less. And Russo calmly, professionally, subtly, and probably I would say quite brilliantly, responded to Cornette's diatribe very well. You may or may not like Russo, but I thought that was a very creative way to respond to Cornette, who, let's talk about this air quote epic promo. I get that Cornette has a shtick. He denies the shtick, but he has a shtick. He goes on these rants and these raves, and sometimes he can't stop talking. I think he has a podcast from 2004 that he's continuing to talk about right now. As we are speaking about this, he hasn't stopped talking. He doesn't stop talking. He's long-winded. And to be honest, you can tell I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of Cornette for a number of reasons. But I do get he has a shtick. He has his character. He is who he is. And some like it and some don't. But what crosses the line for me, and where it loses my epicness, is the way that this guy went after his family. The way Cornette went after Russo's family, Russo's children, Russo's parents, Russo's wife, anything about Russo. And thinking in this way, he basically, folks, this epic promo was a threat to murder another human being. Do you realize that people are applauding the murder of another human being? and thinking that this is an epic promo. This was one of the most classless things I have heard for a guy calling another person that is apparently with a reputation of classless. This was a pretty classless way to approach his feud. He wants to fight him, which is fine, whatever. People want to fight, whatever. But he's threatening his wife, his children. He's claiming that this guy can't have food stamps. This guy can't do this, that. This guy's poor on the streets. This is complete crap. Really, what Jim Cornette, instead of being praised for this epic promo, he should be pummeled for this epic promo. This is complete embarrassment for a guy that is apparently a wrestling genius. This is lower than a grade 2 level type of promo. Jim Cornette should be embarrassed of his actions. And in any way, at this feud, it looks to me that Vince Russo came out as the more stand-up guy than Jim Cornette. That's my opinion on this. You can like and subscribe to this video. Follow The Bottom Line View on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Comment to me at Kevole on Twitter. And thanks for listening, and we will talk to you soon.